Hello, and thanks for listening to the Goblin Lore Podcast. Just a brief note before we get to this show, we got a lot of great questions from Twitter that we just didn't have time to address in this episode, so we'll be doing so in a future episode. And some of those topics actually are things we've been brainstorming to actually devote full episodes to in the future. In this episode, we're going to talk mostly about our favorite pieces of magic trash, sort of the ridiculous, the nonsensical, the whimsical, or the downright stupid parts of magic lore. We're going to talk about our connections to magic, how we are involved in the community, and how we got involved in magic in the first place. And of course, we have to talk about the brand new story that dropped this past week on magic.wizards.com, the Chronicle of Bolas, the first chapter of the Core 19 story, The Twins. So, without any further ado, let's jump right in. Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to episode 1 of the Goblin Lore Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Redeman. You can find me on Twitter at Findhorn, like the forest, or the brownie, or the elves. And this is just a little bit of an introduction of what we're planning to do with this show. We wanted to look at story, look at lore in the Magic universe, and not just for the sake of looking at lore, not just to understand Magic's story in and of itself, but to find connections between the story of the game that we all love and our own lives. We'll talk more about this later, but there's story can mean so much more than just being an entertainment thing. Story is a representation. Story is a way that we process the world around us. And so we want to take those tidbits, those nitty-gritty details of Magic's multiverse and find out what they mean on a deeper level for us all. For those of you looking for a show that's going to be a recap of story, this isn't exactly what that is going to be. This is going to be digging into lore. We'll recap the relevant points of stories and break down what needs to be said, but we're not going to just do a book report. We're not just going to re-talk about the history of stories. We're going to talk about the concepts and ideas that are important to these stories. So mostly every week, we'll be doing this podcast on a different topic from the real world as it relates to Magic the Gathering. It might be something like, where do planeswalker sparks come from, or how do they function? It might be the metaphysics of the blind eternities. It might be the morality of somebody like Urza the planeswalker. But we're going to be looking at all of these different concepts and figuring out how they function in both the story and world of the game and our own lives. Every episode will have that main theme. We'll also do sort of a quick hit. We'll often have guest co-hosts, although I and one of my regular co-hosts will always be there. And we'll just sort of bring in different experts. We are by no means experts in every part of Magic the Gathering, or Vorthos in specific even. We believe that not only is this an opportunity for you, the listeners, to learn and grow and think, this is an opportunity for us to challenge our own beliefs, our own thoughts, and have other people begin those conversations that are important to us through that lens of Magic the Gathering. And so I'm really lucky to be joined today by my two co-hosts here for episode 1. And I'll throw the ball over to you guys and let you introduce yourselves.
Hello, everybody. I am Hobbs Q. I can be found on Twitter at Hobbs Q. I'm kind of bringing a perspective of this, of one of the things Joe and I have talked about is, how does Magic represent psychology? I am not as versed in some of the storylines. This is going to be kind of my time to learn some of the stuff that I have always been interested in but don't have the knowledge base for. But I do bring kind of information from a different perspective. And the reason I was interested in joining this was I've had some of these discussions online with Twitter people, whether it's the representation of trauma in Gideon, for instance, and even talking about maybe his resiliency versus some other people who have experienced trauma. And so this just seemed like a great opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to kind of bringing the psychology to the Vorthos.
Hello, I'm Alex. I've found on Twitter at Alexander New M. And I'm coming from the perspective of someone who's a casual player of the game, but I'm big in I really enjoy being part of the community and kind of the hanging out aspect and playing and using the game as a creative element. So I have a lot of Vorthos-ness. I enjoy some of the creative elements of the game, but also from a Mel perspective, which is more looking at the mechanics and enjoying how the mechanics work together. And it's a little hard to explain, so I love to use this card as an example to explain sort of the Mel side. It's a card from Future Sight called Ichor Slick. 2 and a black for a sorcery. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. I love this card. It's not a great card, but I love it because the rest of the card is Cycling for 2 colorless and Madness for 3 and a black. So those two mechanics interact in really interesting ways and create different lines of play where you can play it for 2 and a black, you can cycle it for 2, or you can cycle it and because you're discarding it, cast it for its Madness cost. And that's sort of the Mel thing. That I love how these mechanics interact from a crunchy rules standpoint.
Yeah, and we'll get into a little bit more of that Vorthos and Mel discussion because those are kind of the two aesthetic ways of understanding Magic that we'll dig into a bit. And Hobbs, you've got something on the idea of the psychographic profiles too that we'll get to in a second. Yeah, and I'm, like I said before, I'm Joe Redeman. I'm the host of the show. Specifically, I come at Magic from a story standpoint. I have always been fascinated with the flavor text of Magic cards. That's, kind of that first bit of a glimpse into the story of Magic. When you first open a pack of cards, that's how you start knowing, oh, these are people, these are worlds that we're going to, these are, different places that we're trying to discover. And so I'm actually looking above me right now on my desk, and I have, I think 35 or so of the paperback Magic novels from the 90s and early 2000s. And that's I mean, I'm a theater artist, I'm a teacher. For me, it is all about story. It's all about that narrative and finding our way of writing our own narratives. For me, even a game of Magic is, you're retelling the story in a different way. So I that's where I come at it from. And that's why we're doing this show, is because we all bring something different to the Vorthos table. But all of that is a different access point into figuring out why this story means something, why these games mean something to us on a deeper level. So maybe we can talk about the psychographic profiles here first then, Hobbs. Since you're our resident psychologist, what's a psychographic profile and why is it important for Magic players and Vorthoses to know what this is?
Yeah, so I mean, where it started was Mark Rosewater kind of came up with these gamer profiles. It was kind of a way to almost define people's personalities, kind of related to how they see the game and then play the game. And so in particular, he introduced us to Timmy, Johnny, and my mind is going blank this morning. Spike. That all came with the game in different ways. See, Spike, I think, came to my mind last because I'm not a spiky player, even though most of the play group would disagree with that. But these are kind of ways that people could approach the game. And what's very fun about this is that in the Unworld, our silver-bordered world, all of these psychographic have been given cards. So you have Johnny, who's a combo player, and all he cares about is how can he interact with the cards, how can he come up with a ridiculous combo that takes 3 or 4 cards to pull off but is really satisfying when you do. It's really about kind of how those things interact. And then we've got Timmy, who just likes to do big things. I kind of liken it to that amazing kind of one of those memes that shows kind of like the different styles of play, and it shows like Legacy is a chess match, and it shows, I don't even remember, Standard is basically Candyland, and the last one for EDH just basically shows dinosaurs with like laser beams, and I kind of think that is Timmy. Just wants to throw things at people's faces and be big and go, he loves the big cards that come out, like the green monsters and dragons and anything huge. And then you have Spike, and Spike will play the same cards as Timmy and Johnny, but Spike cares about winning. He's going to care more about what the cards kind of do. And so a long time there's been this discussion about that. And later on we got more of some of the aesthetics pieces. What this cast is about is kind of that Vorthos. And I'm going to say we're probably going to tip into that Melvin piece. They came along later. Well, the problem with how they're set up right now is that a lot of them are kind of talked about as if they're categorical. Like people are asked, like, well, what type of Magic player are you? Are you a Spike? Well, are you a Timmy? And I will say, too, that one of the things that has come out over the years, which I think is great, is they did try to more come up with non-gendered terms, or at least kind of, like I don't remember all of them, but it's like Timmy and Tammy.
Johnny and Jenny.
And I don't know what the Spike one is.
Spike was just the neutral, yeah.
Spike is neutral. So, which is great, because the idea was that, every player can kind of be defined by one of these categories. Well, that's not really how life works. And especially as we're going to be talking a lot here about more of the aesthetic pieces, I just want to highlight that idea that none of us are going to be one or the other. And in psychology, we talk about this a lot. Things are not really truly just categorical. Things tend to be on dimensions. So it doesn't even need to be that, Melvin and Vorthos are on the same line. They're their own separate lines, and you can be 0 to 50 on one and 0 to 50 on the other. And it might be, okay, I'm really, really high on Vorthos. I'm pretty low on the Melvin, but you're going to have some interaction. And the same comes with Timmy, Spike, Johnny. I mean, you're going to have basically, you're going to run along those dimensions. And I think it's something important for us to keep in mind when we're talking about Magic.
So if you were to categorize yourself, and I don't mean categorize yourself as put yourself in one bucket, but give us some percentages, Alex. What's your play style? And I know you said you're at least 50-50 Vorthos and Mel. Are you more Mel than Vorthos?
I think from a play style, I probably am more Mel. From what's interesting outside of play, talking and conversing, that's more on the Vorthos side. And that kind of goes a little bit to what Hobbs was saying too, is you're not always one thing, the same thing in this all the time. You can kind of shift a little bit. Like I have more spiky decks sometimes. I have my more Johnny decks. But from looking at the Vorthos Mel spectrum, I think playing I'm more from a Mel. I really like to find the mechanics that interact. I like to find the 2 or 3 things that seem a little disparate, but I can put them in the same deck and they interact in a way that you might not notice. You wouldn't notice from looking at different angles. But then from a conversation standpoint, I think the Vorthos stuff is just a lot more interesting to talk about.
And I think that we've talked about this before, the three of us. One of the decks that I love to play, it some ways intersects in that Melvin and Vorthos, at least in my opinion, because one of my favorite current decks, and has been one of my favorite decks for a long time, is Norrin the Wary Soul Sisters. And we get a character card here. It's a legendary. I mean, Norrin comes into that time spiral block and basically is Sir Robin from Monty Python. I mean, he runs away at everything. I mean, he runs away if something enters. He runs away if something attacks. He doesn't care. He runs away. And it was always just so fascinating to me because here's this story card. And I'm like, wow, it's kind of funny they introduced that. I like that. Yet the Melvin side is then, that's a mechanic that I can play with. That's something that what can I do with this? And not even in a spiky, let's break it. It's just, this is interesting to me. What can it do? What are the ways that I can do it? Well, I can do it to gain life. I can do it to come in and deal damage. And when I play that deck, that is what's in my mind, is really I have this storyline, this narrative about Norrin. But he's just hanging out with his soul sisters. He's just helping them out.
Right. So, Hobbs, then we've categorically determined that you are not a Spike whatsoever. Not in your deck building, not in the way that you play, nothing like that, right? Wink, 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 wink. What would you call yourself if you did have to sort of give yourself percentages?
One of our other playgroup members has commented often that my decks are built to kind of dictate how the game is played, whether I win or not. Mm-hmm. So I play Zosu the Punisher. That's just trying to speed up the game if I want the game to go quicker. I play Rurik Thar because I just want people to not play spells, and I really do try to play something that I can play the deck in such a way that it dictates how the game is played.
So that's a little bit Timmy-ish, actually. Is that what I'd say? Because you're going for a different feel, a different,
Great.
Yeah.
Yes. I just want to be in charge. I mean, I don't know what psychographic that is, but what's interesting is my favorite deck, the deck that has changed the league, is my most Vorthos deck. It's Bolas, and it's Bolas clones and stealing, and we're going to get into Bolas today. I think is kind of some of the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about, and this could be the jumping off point, because at the end of the day, my deck is really about, okay, you're serving Bolas. You don't want to, but you are.
Right.
Liliana knows what I'm talking about.
I was just going to say that is a perfect jumping off point, because this week we had the first Core 19 story drop, and it was a doozy of revelations. So just to recap a little bit of story, we're not going to do this often where we dig super deep into recapping stories or like talking about, I don't know. We'll have some speculation and all that, but that's not the core of what we're going to do. But this end of the Dominaria story arc, we saw that Liliana broke her pact with the demons, finally got free of them, but all of her pact lines, her pact tattoos were still there. And it was revealed that the pact was defaulted then to Nicol Bolas, who had brokered it. And so she now is essentially a slave to Bolas. And so now we move into Core 19, and the first thing that we see is essentially the birth of Bolas. And as our resident Bolas historian and scholar, Hobbs, do you want to break down the biggest reveal of this story?
Well, it was revealed that we have Bolas and Ugin. I mean, they kind of have been set up now finally in a great way to be juxtaposed as kind of the yin and yang, the fight between us. People are going to say it's the fight between good and evil, and they're right. They just don't have the side correct. And what we learned is that Ugin and Bolas are twins.
Mm-hmm. And I thought even the most interesting part of this too is that you see in this story, Bolas is focused very much on his current, present physical realm, the existential dangers around him. Like, we've got to save our sister, this sort of stuff. We got to get revenge for our sister. Whereas Ugin is looking at the world through this lens of hazy discovery, of this dreaming almost. So you have revenge on one hand, you have dreaming and possibility on the other. And that, again, like you said, yin and yang seems like a really great a really great way to represent this. It's very two opposite ends of what a dragon's ideal could be.
And something interesting that kind of dovetail what you're saying, Joe, you see Bolas be a lot more immediate. Right now, we need to deal with what's right now, except we look in the future, in our present time in the Magic storyline, he is very plot, long timeline oriented. So it's like, is this a skill he picked up from Ugin? Is this something he picked up somewhere along the lines? So hopefully as the stories go forward, they start to fill in some of that background. We get to learn when Bolas started to become the plotter and the schemer that he is today.
I personally think it started right after the fact that Ugin stole the right to name himself. I mean, that you don't take that from a dragon.
This should be a podcast in and of itself. This is a connected and really intricately woven universe, and I think Magic Story team is super aware of that. They're really tying this stuff together and creating, sort of a unified mythology for us to dig into and find and figure out what it is that means something to us.
And I want to kind of come back a little bit to what we being as we are our first podcast and how these things work, we had technical difficulties and lost our first whole story because we recorded this the day basically that we learned about the twins thing. And what we were discussing on that day too was this fascinating piece of us kind of wanting to know how Bolas basically became Bolas. I mean, it touches on what Alex was just talking about, that he's this discovery point. And we've not known how Bolas sparked.
Yeah, we don't know how he came to be this interplanar consortium guy. You know, like, we don't know anything. He's one of the biggest movers and shakers behind the scenes, and we don't know anything about his backstory until this Core 19 storyline.
And so we were talking a little bit last time about kind of what we know about Bolas. Now, I've told you guys my theory completely is that this is all a Twilight Zone based theme. Bolas got involved with some killing of people. I don't know how. It probably wasn't his fault. But what he wanted to do was sit around and read in his library, and his glasses probably broke and sparked.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you take that one, Alex. What are your thoughts on this? On Hobbs's take here?
I think that until we have a better theory, our resident Bolas ambassador probably is the most reliable source that we have.
I'm sorry, did you say Bolas apologist?
Oh, that works too. Yeah.
I never understand that term. I mean, what am I apologizing for? Being right? I mean,
Well, yes, because Bolas is so humble that he's always right, but, he'll let you learn that on your own.
Right. What we know about Bolas today, let's just stick with the art, okay? We've had wizards try to kind of change history by giving him these, even in From the Vault Dragons, an actual dragon-looking art. But what we know is that Bolas was just a chill old dragon in a big library. That's all we know about him. He's sitting around, books around him everywhere. Glasses on, chilling.
And my question is, how do you go from chilling, reading your favorite weathered copy of Wuthering Heights to literally withering an entire plane of children warrior fighters on Amonkhet? Like, that's I want to know what that arc is.
His glasses broke. I mean, this is that simple.
Yeah, it is interesting though to see what they're doing with this Core 19 story, and that we are going to get a lot of the questions, I think, answered about who Bolas is. But I don't know. Do you think revealing all that stuff is going to lose some of the mystique of Magic's Big Bad, or do you think that'll flesh out some of that stuff? Do you want to take this, Alex? Sure.
I think there's a little risk of that sometimes, and it depends on how they want to frame him and how they want to use him. You see a lot of monster movies. They hide the monster for a while because as soon as the thing that you imagine is more terrifying than the thing that they can show you. But on the flip side, I think what they're trying to do with Bolas is make him a fully fledged character, in which case the more you know about where he came from, the more you know about his motivations and his goals. To some extent, you can't know all the details, otherwise it ruins the fun. But the more you understand about him as a person, the better character it is, the more compelling the conflict is, because now you have real people on both sides conflicting.
I agree with that. I think something interesting too, just to sort of cross fandom streams here, is I was recently listening to a podcast about Star Wars, and they recently, maybe like a year ago, released a novel about Captain Phasma, one of the new characters from the new trilogy. That she's she's like the lead stormtrooper person. Gwendolyn Christie plays her. Super interesting character to me in the theory, but they haven't really fleshed her out in the movies. But in this book, we get her backstory, and the people on this podcast were saying, "Oh, well, we were expecting them to sort of make her a sympathetic character, but what you find out through this story is that even from like the earliest time that Captain Phasma was involved, was doing things, she was sociopathic. Like, she was just murdering everybody. And so I'm curious to find out, like, already we see those tendencies in Bolas in this first story, and is that, I wonder if we are going to get a sympathetic view of him, or if we're going to get some of that some of that more like, nope, he's just kind of always been.
And I'm going to stop you right there. I think it also comes down to what I can see with Bolas is it's not going to necessarily be that we're going to, at the end of the day, be sympathetic or that we're going to think that he's a good person. He is. But, I mean, not everybody else is going to believe this. But what we may get is at least an explanation for why he's doing what he's doing. And he may have a reason that we don't agree with. Even at the end of the day, we may not end up agreeing with it, but there may be a reason. When we were talking before, I kind of likened him to Thanos. And this is a full spoiler alert for anybody that hasn't seen Infinity War yet or read the comics. But Thanos, in some ways, I mean, he's been behind the scenes. We introduced him very early in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He's in the background, right? Which is how we've known Bolas really as of for now. He's manipulating planeswalkers, and he's manipulated multiple planeswalkers that do his bidding. But we don't know what the big plan is. And what we find in Infinity War, and I don't know where we're going with Bolas, but what we find is that Thanos' motivation, at least where he believes he's coming from, is that the universe is finite in its resources and it's got overcrowding and we need to deal with that. And it could be that Bolas, at the end of the day, believes that he's the only one that can kind of stop the multiverse from collapsing. Because we've talked about this. There was a time when the multiverse basically could have collapsed. And it was more just like it'd be really inconvenient for him to do that. He doesn't like to die.
Right. And that was the whole time spiral block, is where those time rifts had really racked Dominaria, and so much so that the mana was literally seeping out of the plane. Like it would have, and as I believe that point in Magic history, still Dominaria was considered the Nexus. Is that right, Alex? Sort of the center of the multiverse.
Yeah, and if it went down, a lot of the multiverse was going to collapse with it. Yeah.
So Bolas somewhat contributed to helping fix in time spiral, because if there's no multiverse for him to rule. So I mean, it is that interesting push-pull. I think there are a lot of interesting real-world analogies that we can talk about with Bolas as, might makes right, as this sort of, as this dictator. And there's a lot of real-world stuff going on right now that we should discuss as it relates to that too, but we can get into that at a later date. I want to shift us a little bit here to something that might be just a little more whimsical. We're gonna do the heavy stuff too, but we always also like to have fun. And one of my favorite things to sort of get to know somebody is find out like what their favorite parts of trash is about something they love. And I don't mean trash as in like they think it's just terrible. That can be one definition of trash. But for me, trash is also like, I loved watching Jersey Shore back in college because it's such garbage. It's so fun because of how ridiculous it is. And so for me, there are some parts of Magic history or Magic gameplay or Magic story that are just ridiculous and fun because they're nonsense. So I want to ask you guys, to talk about like either what's the thing that you love to hate in Magic story and trash in that way, or maybe more so, what is your favorite trashy bit that you're like, ooh, that's just so goofy nonsense that I can't look away. It's so much fun.
I don't know that it's my favorite right now, but it is one that's pretty recent and kind of relevant. Kind of noticing that it seems like the homunculi in Magic just don't have any vowels in their names. Like we started with Fibblethip, and the card Totally Lost, and then he became a big deal. And why wouldn't he be? He's just amazingly cute and unfortunately lost. It's tragic. But then we run into Micklefed, who is the card jeering homunculus from Conspiracy Take the Crown. But in the flavor text, it has Micklefed, actually a reference back to Totally Lost. And so at 2, it was maybe a coincidence, but then we get to Kylem, and we finally have Zindersplit, our first homunculus legend. And I think now once we get to 3, this is definitely a pattern. So it seems like that might just be a thing in the world building. And this is 3 different worlds too. We've got Fibblethip on Ravnica, we've got Micklefed on Fiora, and now Zindersplit on Kylem.
Yeah, and Battle Bond is the set. Yeah. Yeah, and that's fascinating too because homunculi haven't been a featured part of really much of these stories.
And like you said, they weren't really a part of the story until really Battlebond made them an integral part of Kylem. They are the referees for the games that take place at Valor's Reach.
Yeah, and so it's super cool to me that the story team or that, you know, continuity, whoever is sort of in charge of that, has that deep of a sort of world building thing about them, even down to that there's a naming convention. We mentioned J.R.R. Tolkien off air, and that seems very similar to what Tolkien did with the elves. You know, he developed this whole language specifically for the characters in his books. Like, that's wild to me.
And I think that what's funny to me too is that what we're seeing here is that maybe it's like with I'm guessing that what it is that the homunculi are just Welsh, and they either have all vowels or no vowels in their name.
So, Hobbs, why don't you let us know what's your favorite trash in the Magic universe?
Yeah, I mean, mine is, and I get made fun of a lot of on Twitter for different various correct viewpoints I have, whether it's white bordered cards or Nicol Bolas. But one of the ones that I think people think that I'm joking about, and I'm not, is Foglio art. I actually love Foglio art. I really do. It's very different. It's not necessarily what Wizards wants at this point, but it is that different 80s, 90s fantasy that I wouldn't mind even returning to a plane that for some reason is like an 80s, 90s era D&D cartoon, that we have the Foglios and some of those other artists. I mean, even Richard Kane Ferguson coming back with his watercolors, but it's a different style. And with the Foglios, to me, I think the piece that sticks out is Sulphurous Springs. We have Ice Age going on. We have the first time we really show up with the kind of the allied paired Painlands, and we get a demon something chilling in a hot spring with his arms up around it like it's a spa. And I just love that. And what's interesting to me is like the Foglios get knocked a lot for that weird kind of quirky, whimsical style. But we also then now have the people that are responsible for the Mishra's cards that are so integral, the factories and the workshops. We also get the factories that span the seasons and have that same look in different seasons in these treehouses. I love that art, and I really do appreciate it. And, there's a lot of discussion, I guess, within the art portion of the Vorthos community that it's not really high art, but to me, it's a part of like it's like the OC of Magic for me, the Orange County. I mean, I just love it.
Yeah, well, Kaya Foglio did the OG Millstone too, and the OG Energy Flux. I mean, like, I don't think
Kaja.
Oh, is it Kaja? Yeah, she did those ones, and I think those are some of the most revered cards, not just for what they do, but because those arts are so iconic, you know. And it's not this grounded sort of thing, but it's fun. I mean, I love that you can see the expressions on characters' faces. Like in Stone Rain, you have this little goblin who looks like it's wearing almost like a mink coat, running away from these like meteors coming down. It's great.
Yeah, and as a person who started playing in Revised, I'll tell you, the art on Sorceress Queen just makes me think of magic. Like that's one of the few like pieces of art that just brings me back to those days. Yeah,
absolutely. It has that element of the. I mean, it's 90s in its actual timeline, but it has that feeling of almost the Stranger Things sort of 80s D&D, high fantasy sort of stuff. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, which is where we came from. That's where our game came from.
Right.
And it really, especially in those early days, for me, it had helped to evoke this wider world, like that could exist. And you had the art that was a little bit, the different artists next to each other that evoked different versions of the world. And it was like, well, this is just this wide scape because I'm getting just these little glimpses in this art and this art of all these different places.
And I wonder too if in a sort of thinking about this in-universe thing, these are different these are different artist representations, maybe in that world of what they're seeing. And so you maybe get a character, I don't know, just like the Goblin King, for instance. Like the Foglios did a Goblin King that's this pudgy little, sharp-toothed guy that's sunk into his chair and just looks like he's a kid on a stack of candy. And then you have somebody like Pete. I think Pete Venters did one too, and he's much more regal and much more like the ugly goblin that we know today. And I like that idea that it's separate artists representing the same thing, like we would see in the real world, where two Renaissance artists have completely different styles, but maybe they're painting a similar sort of thing, a castle one way and then a castle a completely different way.
Well, I mean, like you said, I know that there's been a knock. I mean, the move has been towards uniformity. I know that there still is a lot of variations in the art. Linneman points this out a lot, that the art is very different, and you could show how it is different. But it is still, like they said, it's not like you don't get within the same set kind of disjointed looking things. At the same time, that is the real world. We all see things, let's go back to is it a yellow dress or is it a blue, green? Well, I don't even remember. But the point being that we have perspectives. And so what you're saying about the Goblin King is, whose perspective is that from? Is it from the other goblins? That may mean something very different than if you're having the Venters version, which is somebody on the outside looking in.
Right. No, I love that. Yeah, I love the Foglio art, even though it draws a little bit of ire. Maybe because it draws a little bit of ire.
So what's yours, Joe?
Mine, I'm going to bring it home with another artist, actually, sort of. It's a good leaping off point for me. So fun fact, actually, I went to the same high school as magic artist Jeff Miracola. And when he comes to the GP in Minneapolis this summer, I'm really hoping to have a vintage artist deck of his built so that he can play it. But Jeff Miracola was the guy who invented the dumb little creatures that we know as Beebles. And they're these tiny pink, sometimes grayish little balls. They look like squished down teddy bears almost. They're just like little ball bodies with like sort of bear ears, but then they have these long spindly arms and legs and like big buggy eyes, and they're just so stupid. They're like Magic's version of, I don't know, like if Lemmings crossbred with the golden snitch from Harry Potter. Like, that's sort of what I envision this. They're just like, so the backstory of Beebles is that they were this essentially proto-homunculus that the wizards on the Tolarian Academy created as lab rats, essentially. They were supposed to be like dumb test subjects. And then they all of a sudden just started reproducing like crazy and started, essentially just pouring out of the corner, the cracks of the walls in the academy. And
they also developed them as lab rats and then ate them.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that? The card?
I mean, saute. There's literally a Beeble recipe, and it's like talking about how great Beebles are and how you want to choose the correct Beeble for your. I mean, the card is called saute. That's all we need to know right there.
And I believe it's a card, a different card actually too, that says. I'm going to blank on the name. I'll look it up while I'm saying this. But Rain, the Academy Chancellor, who's the wife of Baron, the wizard headmaster of Tolaria. Oh, it's Bubbling Beebles.
Yeah.
Here, I'll read this verbatim. Chancellor Rain canceled the annual Beeble roast. I should have married a crueler woman. Like, Baron actually is so mad that the annual feast of the Beebles, feasting on Beebles, was canceled. Like, that he's insulting his wife. Like, come on, man.
Well, I basically think the way you describe them, Joe, is like you describe this lemming versus snitch, but I also think you basically just called them the Ewoks of the Magic the Gathering world.
Oh, 100%. They are adorable. Like it's the same sort of thing, though. Ewoks are small teddy bears that like are so. This is another Star Wars podcast, but they're like tiny, like warrior people who just weaponize anything around them, and all of a sudden, like, Beebles just make stuff blow up on accident.
Yeah.
They're amazing.
Well, and you told us last time that there is Ewok jerky, which is like very uncomfortable to me.
Yeah. There's a lot of parallels. Well, we should dig it. We should do a Beeblecast. If we can get Miracola on for a Beeblecast, that would be amazing. I'm writing that idea down. I'll email him. Beeblecast.
Beeblecast.
That's our show. Thanks for listening, Podwalkers. Remember, you can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod on Twitter. You can email us at goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. Joe Redeman can be found at Findhorn, that's FYND Horn on Twitter. Hobbs Q can be found at Hobbs Q on Twitter. And Alex Newman can be found at Alexander New M. Thank you all for listening, and remember, let sleeping elder dragons lie.